I don't know, Dave. You're sitting right across the table from me. Do you have certified, verified, government-approved passport that proves that you've been vaccinated?
Well, apparently, contrary to the president's, I guess, beliefs, I couldn't figure out the government website on how to use it.
Man, well, hold on though. But you don't have dark colored skin,
right?
The president made it clear that only people with dark colored skin can't figure out websites.
I can't explain it, and despite all of my background in tech and media, I couldn't figure it out. It kind of reminds me. It's like I'm predicting this whole thing is going to turn into the same thing as the Obamacare website when it first launched.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. The whole thing crashed.
You know, I wonder if Biden blames Obama for that. Never mind.
Oh my, maybe. I mean, he made it very. The president of the United States made it very clear that he thinks people with black skin and brown skin and dark hues of skin in general, they're just not very smart. We can't expect them to figure out how to use a website. So how could you expect a black president to, commission the building of a website that was actually going to work?
Dare we say Joe Biden might be a little racist?
Wow. Look at that. Here we are, 2021, and progressives are still fixated, obsessed on the subject of skin color.
Well, just remember, as Joe Biden told us during the campaign, poor kids are just as smart as white kids.
That's right.
So let's get serious for a minute. Obviously, the big topic of the moment are these vaccine passports that the administration is suggesting, and there are so many ways to take this conversation, and there are so many ways that freedom people on social media are taking this conversation. Some right, some wrong.
Let's be clear about some just basic facts. Nothing has actually been created as of yet, right? There are proposals floating around. Including proposals from the President of the United States and others, that we should do something like this. But my understanding is there is no concrete plan in place right now. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding as well. And further, at least for the moment, for some reason, the most progressive president since FDR has decided that, at least for now, the private market, the private industry is the best way to do this. Now, I don't know. You got to believe just with their foundational ideas, the way they believe things have to work, he's going to at one point say, well, okay, it's going to be private businesses who are giving these passports out, but they have to be accredited by the government. They have to be allowed to. And we've seen that with the vaccine, right? We've talked about in the past, I'm part of a membership-based healthcare program with a doctor.
Right.
That doctor has been applying since I want to say November, December, has been applying to be an administrator of the vaccine. He has somewhere around 400 patients, and he has been applying to be allowed to administer the vaccine, and the government still hasn't given him that permission. So you still have these government-controlled – the government is going to maintain control of this one way or another, regardless of whether it's done in the private market or it's done with an actual government-style passport.
Well, let's just throw out for our listeners to make sure we all, this is clear. I mean, there would be a simple private way. I've not gotten the vaccine yet. I probably will. Haven't yet. I'm in my typical way. I like to be, wise and cautious, and I'm kind of waiting to see what happens to people who get the vaccine. But I'm assuming when you do get it, you probably get some kind of receipt. You have to something. My wife got the vaccine, and she has some kind of little piece of paper that says on there the date when she got the vaccine. She could slip that in her purse. She could carry that around with her. There's her ID, and I suppose anyone that she wants to share that information with, she could always pull it out and say, look, here's my proof I was vaccinated. And I suppose any private property, someone's home or someone's business, if an owner says, only people who've been vaccinated are welcome to come onto my property, and someone like my wife wanted to go onto their property, she could hold her card up and say, this is the date I was vaccinated. And that would, I assume, that would solve, both parties. It could be a mutual voluntary agreement. That would be a private way to do this for those people who care about it. And then I suppose there'll be lots of other people who say, hey, I have a business or I'm inviting people to my house and I don't care if you've been vaccinated or not. Okay, then it's not even an issue.
Sure. There are two problems with that. First of all,
is it too simple?
Well, it's too simple for progressives.
Right.
The first problem with that is, I guess not a problem. One of the benefits of that model is if you're not vaccinated and you still want to go to that business or still want to have that on a local one-on-one individual level, you can have that conversation with the business owner, with the property owner. Say, look, I haven't gotten vaccinated. Here's why. And they can say, okay, if you still want to come in, here are the precautions I expect you to take, or vice versa. And there's the whole conversation about at what point does the business owner feel like we've reached herd immunity or cases are going down. There's all kinds of conversations that can happen one-on-one.
And that's kind of that's sort of what free people do. We haven't really talked about this before, but there's a little coffee shop right next door to our office, and we go over there very frequently. We get coffees in the morning. We've gotten lunches there, and we go there often. And the owner, who's a very nice person, she's asked that people put on a mask. And so you and I, when we walk in there, we put on a mask, and it's not because of any government command or edict. It's her property,
Sure.
and we like her, and she's perfectly pleasant. And she's asked that people coming onto her property put on a mask. So we slip on a mask when we go in there and take it off when we leave.
I guess the other benefit there is if I want to bribe her, at least I'm giving her the money and not just giving it to some government official who's going to create a rule for everybody simply because I bribed that government official. Then he creates rules for everybody.
Right.
And those rules have to apply to everybody rather than the one-on-one exchange. But at the end of the day, I think the reality is there's a lot of people like you, like me, who are still waiting to kind of see what are the responses to this. I'll share a little bit of family history. We've shared some personal things.
Yeah.
In the early days of the flu shot paralyzed my grandfather. He had a bad reaction between one medication he was taking and the flu shot, and it caused something to swell in his vertebrae.
Wow.
And it cut his spinal cord.
Wow.
And he was
It's a terrible
paralyzed
story.
from above the waist down. And he spent the last 5 or 6 years of his life in a hospital bed that they had to put in their living room.
Unable to move.
Unable to move. My grandmother spent those years changing bedpans, sitting next to a hospital bed in their house. So I would go out to visit. They were in New York. I would go out to visit, and we couldn't go do anything. We would just sit at their house because he couldn't move, and he was still of sound mind, and he could have great conversations, and he could use his hands, which was really helpful. He and I used to sit and play cards on his hospital bed and things like that. But
you're talking about something as innocuous and as commonplace as a flu shot,
Right.
And the flu shot in itself, right, tends to have very, very small numbers of complications, but start mixing flu shots with other medications,
Right.
And nobody has even the flu shot. Nobody's been able to test the flu shot against all medications out there, right? There's just too
or all
many
types of medication.
Exactly.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not even.
Yeah.
We talk about the truth of the Pythagorean theorem. You don't have to test every right triangle.
Right.
We haven't gotten to the point where you've made enough tests yet to know that interactions aren't going to go bad and different things like that.
And that's the flu shot.
Right.
It's been around for a long time.
But this was in the 80s. This was in the mid to late 80s when this happened.
Yeah.
And it was earlier days of the flu shot.
Gotcha.
And for that I always tend to be a little more careful. I waited years before I started getting the flu shot. I wanted to know that they had kind of reined it in and things like that. So the idea of having to have a vaccination passport is it's a more complicated issue than you've either had the vaccine or you haven't had the vaccine, and there's this tendency from the left, from the progressive left, to say you just must be an anti-vaxxer. Trust the science. The science says the vaccine is safe. Well, nothing is safe 100% of the time.
Right.
And some people are a little more cautious about things like that. A little more cautious about what is the risk reward here, and there are going to be some issues with that. I think the point and the bigger point is it's a more complex issue than a vaccine passport makes it out to be. But the vaccine passport itself makes things even more complicated as well. It is going to make the world more complicated. It's no longer just a one-on-one conversation of, do you feel comfortable with me coming into your house? Why or why not? It's now, show me your passport. Well, I don't have one. Well, why not? You should. Everybody says it's safe. You should. And we start getting into a little bit of a more complex relationship because the government has inserted itself into the one-on-one relationship with other people.
And here I'm actually gonna stand. I don't do this very often, but I am going to align myself with progressives, because progressives have made the argument that requiring people to get IDs is not just complicated, it's intolerably.
Right.
It's something we shouldn't you can't expect people to have, certainly not when it comes to voting. You can't expect people to actually be able to get an ID. There's all kinds of people who are poor and people who are disadvantaged in various ways. And according to Joe Biden, people with dark colored skin, they can't get an ID. So if they can't get an ID, well, then how in the world are they going to be able to get a vaccine passport? And here I'm going to throw out a proposal. Everyone listening, this is a little tongue-in-cheek. I'm not really being serious. I'm just kind of being a smartass. What if we connected voting to having a vaccine passport? You need a vaccine passport to vote. There's problems with that, but part of me major problems. But part of me wants to just see what progressives would say about that.
Well, here's the interesting, where I think Joe Biden ended up in this whole conversation, and the reason he is pushing for a private solution to it is because one thing progressives, I'll give them some credit now myself. One thing they're really good at is they're really good at floating out ideas and seeing how people respond before they take action. And they're really good at leaking things, right? We saw the progressives in the DOJ and the FBI, they leak things all the time. They slip something to a member of the press and say, hey, go float this idea, and we want to see how people respond to it. So it doesn't come like it's from Joe Biden. But we know that it was the administration that floated this idea of vaccine passports first.
Right.
This did not come from, it wasn't groups of people saying, hey, Joe, we want vaccine passports. Will you give them will you make sure everybody has them? No, he came up with he didn't come up with any ideas, but somebody.
To be clear, I bet there are some crony businesses out there that produce laminated identification cards who are probably part of the conversation right now, hoping that they get the contract.
So there are people within the administration who said, you know what, we need everybody to get vaccinated. There's all these people who they perceive as anti-vaxxers. Somebody like me who is a little hesitant to get a new vaccine. I'm not anti-vaccine. I've traveled the world. I've taken plenty of vaccines in my life. I am certainly not anti-vaccination. I am, however, carefully pessimistic about new vaccines. I like to see how they do it, and that's from life experience, right? So that we talked about. So
I like the phrase prudentially cautious.
Okay.
Yeah.
Prudentially cautious.
Cautious. Yeah.
So you have this idea that comes from within the administration. They go float it out there. And what happened, and we saw this, what happened was people on the far left, people who align themselves with AOC, Ilhan Omar, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, those people went nuts. They said, Joe, you can't do this. This is racist. For the exact reason you're talking about. We've been telling you for years, you can't expect people with dark skin to go get voter IDs. That's racist. You also can't expect them to go get vaccine passports.
Right.
Joe, you can't do this because people in poor neighborhoods don't have as much access to the vaccine, even though the government's paying for it or taxpayers are paying for it, however you want to. I mean, that's a whole other conversation.
Yes.
But there's timing issues, there's availability issues, there's single parent households, there's all of these things that prevent that. And members of that far progressive left who want equity say that vaccines are not currently equitable. Access to vaccines are not currently equitable.
Right.
And they push back on Biden, right? So he's having his administration. I keep saying he, but everybody should just know when I say he, I mean his administration, because we know there's other people pulling the strings. That administration is sitting there saying, well, we think there needs to be some encouragement for people to go get vaccines. We think the only way to keep people safe is to have everybody out there been vaccinated. We need to encourage that. So we need some kind of middle ground. And they came up with this privatization of the vaccine passport.
They're looking for some sort of either incentive to get vaccinated or a disincentive to not be vaccinated. And if more places start requiring some kind of proof, that's basically what that provides is a disincentive to not be vaccinated. It means you might not get to go to some concerts or stores or gyms or various things like that.
And that's a real concern. I mean, for me, right? I'm playing this sort of timeline game of I want to observe and be prudential.
Right.
But at the same time, I have an opportunity to travel internationally in October, and I have to figure out they're probably not going to let me go. Yep.
And this is related to one of the strategies progressives figured out many decades ago. We've talked here at length on this podcast about the politicization of everything, how progressive government means government involvement in everything, and therefore everything becomes political. One of the many tools, weapons really is what I should say, that progressives have at their disposals to get government involved is this idea of accreditation. And this really first cropped up, this is a century ago when the first accreditation agency started being formed. And you see it emerge in the realm of higher education.
Right.
So every college, every university, with very few exceptions, there are a handful of institutions of higher education that are not accredited, and they struggle mightily because many students don't want to go to a school if it's not officially accredited, right? Who's gonna recognize a degree from a non-accredited school? Who's gonna donate money? Who's gonna give money to a non-accredited? So there are enormous incentives to be accredited, and these accreditation agencies, they're these very interesting creatures. They're quasi-private, but also quasi-government entities. They're closely connected with the Department of Education. So when an accreditation agency comes to your university and it's a long, drawn-out process. It can take months. It can take years. When I was teaching at Hillsdale College, we were going through accreditation, and it tends to be for a limited period of time, 5, 7, 10 years, something. Sure. You get this accreditation, then you have to go through the whole process again. It's this big, long, drawn-out process, and part of the accreditation to get accredited is you have to show that you're in compliance with the Federal Department of Education, all their rules, regulations, guidelines. So that's a way, right? The federal government can say, hey, we don't regulate colleges and universities. There's some truth to that. They don't directly, but they certainly do indirectly through that whole mechanism of accreditation. And so it's interesting to me that we're talking about possible vaccine passports in that same arrangement, right? That, well, there'll be private businesses and organizations that produce these passports, yes, but they'll be accredited by government agencies, which is a way for government to have oversight of all this.
And keeps open, as I said earlier, keeps open the opportunity to bribe government officials to get
That's right.
to get certain favors and kickbacks and promises and everything else.
That's right.
So we talk about that, right? And that level of accreditation and everything that goes into that. And it just makes me think everything about progressivism makes things more complicated. I mean, think about how complicated that process is. If you wanted to just start teaching tomorrow, right? If you just said, hey, you know what? I'm teaching and I'm going to give you a diploma. If you come and you meet with me in a group of this many people for the next 4 years, I'm going to give you a piece of paper that says, I certify that you learned enough from me. Your PhD, you probably meet all of the requirements of accreditation, but you have to go through all these government forms and everything else to make it valid, to validate somebody. The government now has to validate you as a professor, your previous experience, your educational background, none of that counts until you've finally gotten that piece of paper from
They
the
get
government.
down into the weeds and they create all kinds of new. I remember when I was at Hillsdale, we were going through this. They wanted detailed descriptions of the rubric that we use for assigning grades on assignments and grades in classes. And I remember being in a faculty meeting looking at some of my fellow faculty members. And I said, "Am I the only one? Here's my rubric." I read it, I read the paper, and then I make a judgment based on all my experience I've had. Is this an A paper or a B or a C or a failing paper? There's my rubric. But that's not scientific enough for the bureaucrats. They love the intricate processes. One of the examples I've used, I've talked about this with my kids since they were little. They've heard me use this example. Think of some big, complicated form that you have to fill out. Here's an example. Suppose you were applying for an SBA loan. The SBA, Small Business Administration, is a federal. It's an agency of the federal government, and the paperwork is ridiculous. And they have all these lengthy forms with,
Yes.
30 lines on each page. Imagine the people who design the form. And imagine how excited they get when they've had the same form for 12 years and then they decide they're going to add a little checkbox. Mm-hmm. And think of all the meetings that happen with all the bureaucrats. Should we put that checkbox in? What should be next to the checkbox? Should the checkbox be here or should it be there, right? This is the kind of detail complexity that makes their life exciting. They get to change the form. They added a little box onto the form. And then, of course, after people are filling them out and signing, then more bureaucrats are keeping track of who checked the form and who didn't check that little box and those sorts of things. That's the complexity that progressive central planning brings to everything.
Well, we've talked about this before. Doesn't actually solve the problems it intends to solve, right? Complexity, just because something's more complex doesn't mean it's better. It doesn't mean it's more effective. When we're talking about vaccine passports, is it more effective to have a government-accredited passport system that says, yes, you've officially gotten your passport and you've been vaccinated and you're a legitimate human being again. You're equal. You're an equal human being under the eyes of the law, but without it, you're not anymore. Or is it better to have just a simple conversation with somebody? Have you been vaccinated? Yeah. No. Why not? Okay, I'm uncomfortable with you coming in without these precautions.
Right.
Okay, I'll either choose to follow your rules or I'll go buy from somebody else.
Freedom is simple. There's a simplicity in freedom.
The problem really arises, what we haven't touched on is, okay, so we've talked about accreditation, we've talked about all of these things. What happens when the government is also funding the business? What happens when government subsidies?
Yeah.
We've focused more on the regulation side of it so far.
Right.
An airline. Airlines have not been very successful over the last 2 decades.
Right.
They've taken a lot of money from the government.
Right.
Those airlines are at the moment, especially coming out of the virus, they're going to be reliant on the government, or they need full flights. They need to start. People want to start flying again. They need to start selling tickets.
They're both. The airline industry is one of those industries that is both highly regulated and highly subsidized at the same time.
Right.
They're almost, not quite, but they're almost extensions of the federal government. They operate the way the federal government, the way the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, tells them to operate. That's right.
Right. So if you have two airlines and they are both dependent on those government dollars.
Yes, indeed.
And the airports are owned by the government.
Yes.
And the runways are owned by the government. And the paths in the sky are controlled by the FAA, controlled by the government. How is an airline supposed to say, no, we would rather just have one-on-one conversations, or no, we're just comfortable selling, being this type of business who doesn't require a passport?
It gives, with subsidies comes enormous control of the person or the organization who's giving the subsidy over the recipient. There are a number of stories I want to tell here on this particular subject I taught for just a few semesters at it's a small Christian school, university. Many people think it's private. They call it private. The truth is, there's not much at all about it that's private because it receives enormous amounts of federal funding in all kinds of ways, including federal funding of most of the students who go there. They bring federal grants and loans. The institution receives federal subsidies. And the administration of this school tended to be kind of on the conservative side politically. And when Obamacare happened, it had a provision in there that required this conservative Christian school to provide certain kinds of health care, health insurance that included various abortion services and abortion drugs and things like that. And they thought this was wrong. They didn't want to. They didn't want to provide that. They thought, if our employees want that sort of thing, that they should go pay for it themselves. We as a religious organization, we don't want to do this. So they pushed back. They filed a lawsuit, actually, against the federal government on the grounds of religious liberty. They said this violates our freedom of conscience, our religious liberty. And I remember talking with the president of the school saying, what's your real difficulty here? It has nothing to do with religious liberty. It's the fact that you're dependent on the government. You take all this federal money. And so they have enormous control. If you really want to make these choices, become independent from the federal government. Don't be dependent on those subsidies. As long as you are, you can file lawsuits on religious liberty or any other grounds. But the truth is the government's going to continue to have enormous control over you by the mere fact that you're dependent on them. It's why every teenager at some point wants to get out of his parents' house, right? Yeah. And wants to go buy his own car and have his own place to live, because every teenager knows, as long as I'm living at my parents' house and I'm dependent on them for my transportation, I can't really make my own choices. I'm dependent.
Right. This is the whole point. The level of complexity that any government involvement affects, that school that you're talking about, they could go independent. Mm-hmm. But because of how students rely on student loans, they would have to drastically decrease tuition because students couldn't, if students weren't going to get government-backed loans, there's no such thing as non-government-backed loans. Right. As long as government is helping some businesses,
yes,
it's almost impossible to compete as the business that's not participating.
Yes.
It's like, if we take that back to the airline example, it's like an airline saying, okay, we are totally going off the government dole.
Yep.
We are going to do this as a real business on our own without anything, and we don't want to subscribe to all of the government regulations around this as well.
What that would ultimately require is that business not only purchase their own fleet of airplanes, train their own pilots and staffs and all the support personnel, but also create their own networks of airports and runways and whatever else is, I don't know what's all needed to run it. But basically everything, top to bottom.
Exactly. And probably have their own radar systems. I mean,
that's right.
It could never be profitable.
That's right.
They would have to go recruit all the other airlines to say, okay, we're not going to take government money. And inevitably there is going to be somebody who says, wait, you want me to work, or you want me to I can be a little lazy about it and the government's going to make sure I succeed.
Yes.
We've seen how that works through the welfare system.
That's right. It is very difficult. You business owners out there listening, many of you probably have run into this. It is difficult to compete against any subsidized business. If you're running just as an independent, right? You rely solely on revenue generated from customers who find value in your products and services, and that's it. And you're trying to compete against a business that is subsidized by the government, by tax dollars. That means that competing business can charge far less money because they're being subsidized. How does one compete against that? And of course, with those, so a little bit of subsidy ends up quickly spreading throughout to many different organizations, businesses. It spreads throughout society very fast. And that gives government this kind of power and control, including for all kinds of stupid, unwise, or even nefarious kinds of measures. I was the other night, I was flipping through the TV. Do you remember the old, well, it's not that old, but Tom Hanks did this movie, Captain. He was the captain of a big freighter ship.
Yeah, the one with the pirate, the Somali pirates.
The Somali pirate, which is a true story that absolutely happened. And it's a great movie. I recommend it to everybody. And when you watch it, you realize it's frustrating to watch that movie because here's this enormous ship, this big, cargo freight liner ship.
This one didn't get trapped in the Suez Canal, right?
No, it did not. It did not get trapped. And these little Somali pirates are in this little dingy, dingy boat with a little outboard motor, and they're able to take over this huge ship. If that crew on the big ship had one gun, probably even a pistol, I don't think the thing would have happened. But all the ports where those big freight ships go in, those are all controlled by governments. And those governments have said in our ports, you want to do business in our ports, no weapons allowed, no firearms. This is a gun-free zone. You can't have any guns on your boat.
Yeah.
So that entire big ship with millions of dollars of cargo was utterly unarmed. Oh, they had fire hoses. They could squirt water. They could squirt people with water. That was it. And so this handful of little thugs with a couple machine guns was able to, take over and hijack this entire ship. That's what comes with that kind of control.
Think about what progressives fail to think about is how their central planning. Mm-hmm. They think, okay, we are going to say that our ports are a gun-free zone, right? That's going to be good for that situation. We're not going to have guns in our ports.
Right.
They don't think through, and we've said this for months. We've said this forever. You can't centrally plan for the needs for every person in every situation. Mm-hmm. It is simply impossible, mm-hmm. right? So whether you're trying to do a vaccine passport, or you're trying to create safer ports, or you're trying to create safer airways or safer roads with driver's licenses and rules and regulations and all of that, at the end of the day, you can't anticipate the needs and requirements and situation for every single person you're trying to centrally plan.
I would add one word: the changing needs and requirements. It's not just that there are 350 million Americans who have different needs and wants and values. The wants and needs and values of each American changes with time. Whatever they value today might be different tomorrow or next month or next year.
So as that happens, it is impossible for the government to successfully central plan for that.
Yep.
What do they always do? The move isn't to say, okay, our bad. This was a mistake. Let's pull back the regulation. We can't plan for this. We can't save you from this. You're going to have to exercise a little bit of self-assertion and a little bit of self-reliance, and you're going to have to figure this one out on your own. Be good people. Don't shoot each other when you're in port. No, they start adding more regulations more regulations and more regulations, which either put people out of business, make it impossible to compete.
Yep.
Or these businesses come and say, wait a minute, you can't put all these regulations on us. We can't afford to operate that way. Okay, we'll pay you for it. We'll start subsidizing. They make this so complex.
So I want to use this as an excuse to weave in a little bit of Adam Smith, who was foremost a moral philosopher and secondarily an economist, a thinker of economic things. And when we think about central planning has a permanent, fatal defect that is impossible to overcome. You're describing it. And there are really two basic reasons. One is what we've mentioned is this infinite complexity. When you're talking about an entire nation of people or the whole global population, no mind can possibly know all the changing wants and needs. I mean, set aside 350 million. Dave, if I tried to figure out what you want and need, that would be a full-time job.
Yeah.
Right? Because day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, I don't know when you're going to be hungry, and I don't know what you're going to be hungry for, and I don't know if the bed you're sleeping in right now is comfortable for you or it's causing backaches, and if it is causing backaches, how is your back going to be fixed, right? And there's no way that I can, for that matter, I can't even know fully how to satisfy all of my own wants and needs. There are some things, I have problems that I can't figure out how to solve my own. There's no way a human mind or a group of human minds can know everything that everybody else wants and needs and values. That's one fatal defect.
Right.
The other fatal defect is the problem of unintended consequences. With every regulation, that you issue a regulation in order to achieve one goal, that regulation likely is going to lead to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 unintended problems. And now you have all these new problems created by the regulation, and this leads progressive central planners to think, oh, we got 5 new problems. Let's create 5 new regulations to solve those. Well, that's going to lead to 15, right? And it escalates. And that's how the Federal Register, that's the actual publication in which federal regulations are published. That's why it grows year after year, decade after decade. We've been getting close to 100,000 pages a year in recent decades of federal regulations.
And for all of those regulations, you have to add more bureaucrats to determine them and manage them and decide what do they mean and how do we enforce them and everything else.
All that. So enter Adam Smith. And his most famous metaphor, which I think a lot of people misunderstand, this idea of the invisible hand. Now, Smith makes it clear. He says, in an environment of freedom, in a free regime where individual human beings are relatively secure in their individual liberty and their private property, they can do what they want with what is rightfully theirs. They can keep it. They can produce things and offer to trade with others. They can do what they want to do. They can be productive. They can be lazy. It's up to them. He said, over time, what you will see happening if you stand back and observe a free society, it is as if there's an invisible hand that seems to be guiding things. It's as if there is a regulator that is omnipotent, that knows everything. The part that people miss, they think there's actually a hand. He's using this as a metaphor. He's saying it's as if there was an invisible hand. There's no hand.
Right.
There's the magic of it is that individuals are talking to each other and they're saying, I have this problem with my back hurts and I'm not sure why. And one person says, well, I got a better bed mattress for you. Maybe that'll help. And a chiropractor says, I think your vertebrae need to be pushed around, right? And a nutritionist says, I got this supplement. It helps with back pain, and on and on. And that's happening millions of times over. Mm-hmm. All these individuals talking with it, trying to figure out what do other people want? What do they need? What do they value? How can I offer something that they will appreciate? And it works precisely because there is no single hand. There is no hand. And that's what he means when he says it's as if there was an invisible hand. Progressives want to be the hand.
Right.
They want there to be a real hand, and they want to be their hand that is controlling what people do with their property and the details of our lives.
Put that into perspective of, you gave the example earlier of the teenager who can't wait to move out of his parents' house.
Yeah.
Put that into the same context of 2 types of children. And we've seen this, right? You were a college professor. You probably saw this more than anything. Who are the more successful kids in college? The ones who had hovering parents who were on them, telling them exactly what to do all the time, whenever they needed to be there. They were always directing them. You need to do this now, and then this next, and then this next. Or was it the students who had parents who were there to answer questions, to guide, to give advice, to give suggestions, but generally let the kid touch the stove and realize it's hot? I mean, right, there are certain things you stop. You don't let a 3-month-old or a 3-year-old put a fork in a socket. Right. They're not developed enough yet to understand that's going to kill you. Right. But you're also going to tell a 12-year-old, if you put a fork in a socket, it's going to electrocute you and you're probably going to die. Oh, okay. I'm going to be smart enough not to do that. Right. But the parents who let their children experience something and realize, okay, this is what happens when I do this, this is going to be the result.
And the difference you're talking about, it actually is it's a fascinating study in psychology in the role of someone like an educator, because you see these, you're talking about the different kinds of parents. The flip side of the coin are the different kinds of students. There are students, there are young people who want the helicopter parents. They're insecure. They're scared of the world. They don't know how to do anything because they've never been allowed to do anything. And therefore,
that's my point.
They want helicopter parents. And then there are the young people who can't wait. They're chomping at the bit to get out in the world and live on their own, knowing, yeah, they're going to make some mistakes. They're going to make some stupid choices, but they want to make their own choices, and they want to get out there and live. And those are the students I was always most interested in, the ones who want to blaze a path, get out in the world, go do things. They're far more interesting than the students who are overly timid and really scared of the world and looking for either their parents or someone else to be, helicopter guardians over them.
Well, and it's the latter that end up being the progressives.
That's right.
It's the latter who go and say, okay, I don't have a parent telling me what to do anymore. I don't have my professors telling me what to do anymore. Who's going to tell me what to do tomorrow? Mm-hmm. Who's going to make sure that person over there doesn't hurt me and doesn't want to hurt me,
right?
And can control everything around me to make sure everything is safe. And the world isn't going to be safe.
And so here's the offer that progressive central planners make. They say, we're here, Johnny. We'll be your helicopter parents. And there are legions of us. There are millions of us in different bureaus. And we're going to control all the people around you. And we're going to control you, too, in return for granting us that control over your life and your property. We promise you perfect safety, perfect health, perfect happiness. And that's the raw deal. That's the rub.
Has that worked out for any of them?
Exactly. Progressives are very quick to give up their liberty, and progressive central planners are very quick to control the lives of others, but they don't actually deliver on the perfect health and the perfect safety. People still get hurt. People still get swindled. People still get cheated. People are still not perfectly healthy. There's still all these risks in the world, even though we've given over control of most of our lives to the bureaucratic class.
So let's compare. I'm not even going to do the intrastate comparison among states in America. Let's compare open economies, a Florida, Texas, something like that, with Europe. Europe has had significantly stricter lockdowns than we have had throughout the United States from the beginning of this. Progressives, I'm trying to avoid bad language. They went to such extents they blamed Trump for this from the beginning.
Right.
You didn't do enough. You should have locked down the economy.
Should be like Europe.
Look at what Europe is doing. Yes. You didn't do enough. Well, now
and that, by the way, that's something of a little litmus test, isn't it? It's interesting. Wherever we see governments controlling, clamping down, locking down, shutting down life, progressives admire it.
Right.
They hold that up as a model. They say, we want to be like that.
Now in Germany, in France, and Spain, and in the United Kingdom, they are having the strictest lockdowns they've ever had. They're in some of those countries, as of this week, even grocery stores are no longer open. You are not allowed to leave your house, right? Despite vaccines being starting to be made available, people are getting vaccinated. They are seeing a rise in cases. They are seeing stricter lockdowns. They're seeing more government control. Why? Because their governments are having their 1936 FDR moment.
Yep.
Hey guys, our intentions were good. I'm sorry, it didn't work.
Yep.
We're going to keep trying. We're going to go find another vaccine. They had to stop selling, I think it was the AstraZeneca vaccine, because people started having an adverse reaction to it. They weren't sure it was effective enough. We're going through all of these things.
Yeah.
And we have now a president, and we have an entire political party who has been saying for years, we're going to take care of you. And they never can. All they do is make things more complex.
More complex. So there's a fellow many of our listeners are probably familiar with, John Stossel. And he's he does a lot of good work on just showing how government interventions and distortions of markets leads to all kinds of bad things. So one of the programs he did years ago, I believe he was in New York City, and it was a short little video program. And he tried to open, I think it was a lemonade stand.
Yes.
He was going to open a lemonade stand and do it according to all the regulations and laws. He wanted to do it. And his purpose was to show, here's what it takes to, and he started by showing, okay, here's my table, and here's my pitcher, and I'm going to put water in it, and I'm going to mix up lemonade, and I have some glasses, and I'm going to sell lemonade for 50 cents a glass or whatever it was.
Right.
It ended up taking, well, in fact, he never could do it. He spent months. You got to fill out this form, then submit to this office. And then this office says, no, but you didn't include this attachment. Well, where do I get the attachment? Well, you got to get that other proviso at this other office, right? And paid all these fees, got all these licenses and permits. Never could actually open his lemonade stand. That's what progressivism has actually given. That's a lemonade stand. So imagine actually trying to open a restaurant, a medical clinic, a school, a factory, anything like that. It makes everything more complex, which means more expensive. And I'm confident there are millions of Americans, including members of the Vino Veritas Society and millions more, who right now, they're just tired, they're exhausted of everything being so complicated. And they're looking around saying, why? Why is everything so complicated? Well, there's one answer: progressive central planning. That's why everything is so complicated. Freedom doesn't make things, freedom makes things simpler. And if things are not simple, one of my favorite phrases, capitalism hates a void. Yeah. Where there's a void, where there's a demand for something that's not being met, free people supply whatever is being demanded. So if there's something people value and it's too complex, somebody is going to figure out how to make a simpler version of it, of the very same thing. Right. That's what happens in a free society.
And there's examples of all of that. But I want to emphasize, as we wrap up, I want to emphasize something you said in that whole soliloquy. It makes things more expensive.
Yeah.
Because at one point, like we said, people are going to, okay, so we created this regulation. We have to hire bureaucrats to monitor that regulation. But that caused these extra problems. So we need new regulations for that. We need new regulations for that. We need new regulations for that. And all of a sudden, now we need more, either to collect more taxes or print more money or borrow more money or something to cover the costs.
Which is two ways. First, we got to pay all those bureaucrats we hired. There's a big expense right there. And the bureaucrats all want pay raises all the time, right? It's funny how progressives will talk about how greedy business owners are. How about the bureaucratic class? They're always demanding more benefits, more time off, right? More perks, higher pay.
The unions that Biden loves so much.
That's right.
The public employee unions.
And so you got to pay salaries for all those bureaucrats, and there are millions of them. At the same time, the businesses now, they can't just open up and offer their service. First, they have to comply with all the regulations, which means they got to hire more personnel. They got to hire lawyers. They got to hire their own bureaucratic staff just to deal with compliance and filling out all the forms.
And then let's not forget the subsidies. Somebody's got to pay for the subsidies.
That's right.
So what does that all mean? We have seen this in taxes already. And things have gotten significantly more expensive since the middle of January when Joe Biden took office. Why? Because he kept saying, well, I'm not going to raise taxes on anybody who makes under $400,000 a year. And then he modified it. I'm not going to raise taxes to anybody who makes less than $200,000 a year. Well, but Pete Buttigieg was on TV this week saying we're going to have to add a significant gas tax. Who does that affect the most?
The poor people.
The poor people who Joe Biden claims to be helping. Joe Biden took down the Keystone Pipeline, made us less energy independent. What was the result? Gas prices are up $1 a gallon already.
So think about that. Gas prices, I've noticed that when I fill up my car, it's significantly more expensive. So gas prices have already gone up, I don't know, to 25, 30%, something like that, over $1 more than it was back in January. And then what are other progressives saying? Oh, we got to add a tax. We got to increase the tax on gas. So you have gas prices already going up because of progressive central planning. And what do progressives want to do? They want to add more taxes to gasoline, which is going to keep driving the price up and up and up. There was a phrase that was popular back in the 1960s among progressives, and I kind of want to bring it back and turn it on its head. The phrase they used to use was the greedy class, the selfish class. And what they meant by what progressives meant by that in the 1960s, there's actually a book by a social scientist titled The Selfish Class. He meant middle-class Americans, people who work and buy homes and take care of their kids, maybe run a business. That was the selfish class, the greedy class. I want to bring that phrase back and pin it right on progressives. That's the real greedy class. They never can get, they always are wanting more, more of what belongs to other people. You and we're capitalists, we're free marketeers, we're business owners. We're not always demanding more from anybody. We're not demanding to take more from anybody, but those in government, the progressives, they constantly want to take more.
Well, and think about that. You talk about it as the greedy class. I was actually in a debate the other night, and the guy kept saying, all of our problems started with predatory capitalism under Reagan. And I said, how can the free, mutual, agreeable exchange of goods between two people be predatory? Are you saying that one party is too stupid to understand what they're trading?
Right.
Well, no, I'm not calling people stupid.
Then how is it predatory?
Right. But in reality, the progressive class are the real predators.
That's right.
The progressive bureaucrats are the ones saying, we're not even going to ask you.
We're going to take it.
Nobody's going out and saying to us, hey, we need to improve infrastructure. Are you willing to pay a new gas tax, an additional gas tax? I think we already pay in Colorado something like 46 cents a gallon on average in taxes to the government. So that's like an eighth of the overall cost of gas, a tenth of the overall cost of gas is in taxes to the government anyway. And they're just saying, okay, we're going to increase that, and it's going to be substantial. I mean, they're talking like 40 cents a gallon.
I want to be clear here. That's an interesting word, predatory. When a business, even a credit card company that offers credit cards and there's a really high interest rate, they cannot make anybody sign up for it. They can't.
Right.
I mean, I guess they could lie, but if they're actually lying, you can sue them. That's a breach of contract. But as long as they're saying, we have this line of credit, we'll make it available to you for 30% interest. It's unwise to take that card, but it's voluntary. In that sense, it cannot be predatory. What can be predatory is when an organization, basically a cartel, that has a monopoly on legalized violence, says, we're going to take your stuff because we want to use it. And if you disagree, we will send stormtroopers in armored vehicles, all decked out in black with automatic weapons. They'll come and they will either shoot you or they will put you in prison, and then we'll take your stuff. That's predatory, and there's only one organization that actually does that, and that's government.
That's government. So let's bring this all back to the vaccine passport.
Yeah.
Right? The only thing it's going to do, and I think this is the core argument against it. And like I said, at the very beginning, we've had people making all kinds of arguments. But the core argument against this is it's never going to end up where it started. It is opening an opportunity for accreditation, which opens an opportunity for subsidization, regulation, restriction, bribery, and essentially more costs and more control by the government to say, are you vaccinated or are you not? And we should never be in favor of anything that is a government-controlled regulation on the interactions between two individuals.
That vaccine passport program, if it's enacted, it will quickly become a great big, either a government or quasi-government program filled with corruptions, staffed by unelected government employees, bureaucrats, who will be part of government unions, who will help fund the re-election of people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the rest of the progressive political class.
Right.
That's what it's really all about. So let's not do that, Dave.
Yeah.
Let's just not do that.
I mean, I think the point is don't try to fight back about it's not legal in this way or it hurts people. Vaccine passports in the long run are going to hurt people. And we need to, as guardians of the American idea, we need to always remember that all of these progressive ideas, in the end, they hurt people. And we need to understand how and why and be able to explain that to people.
So don't be a progressive. Rather be a guardian of the American idea.
That's why we are the guardians. No sumus custodes.
Till next time.